Thank you everyone for coming, those of you who are here face-to-face and online, for this talk, which I've entitled Translanguaging in TESOL, Questions and Controversies. And I quite often use n-grams. I don't know if you're aware of the Google n-gram feature, but it often is a very interesting marker of the popularity of terms. Obviously, translanguaging extends beyond TESOL itself, but when you compare it with other terms, in a recent article, I also compared it with terms such as code switching and plurilingualism to find a similar difference, that translanguaging is a term which, as Lee Wei has commented, has really captured the imagination, of many people in diverse communities around the topic of language education, the broad topic. So I thought I'd address some of the questions and controversies that have recently arisen around translanguaging and translanguaging pedagogy, particularly recently with regard to concerns that code switching, researchers on code switching have often found that the translanguaging discourse is to some extent replacing the previous understandings of multilingual practices, both in classrooms and wider societies. But particularly within our field of language teaching, as those of you who may have either read the pieces that myself and Janine Treffers-Dallas wrote in ELT Journal on translanguaging, and also the ELT Journal debate that we did in 2023 at IATEFL. Since then, some questions have remained in my mind, and I want to kind of come back to these questions and just reflect on them a little bit in terms of recent research, recent scholarship, but also my own opinions, and with regard to a publication I'm writing currently on the issue, the topic of translanguaging in ELT. I'll be using the words ELT and TESOL interchangeably. So I've put down 4 here, which are the ones that I hopefully will be touching on to some degree. The first one, this is kind of the, if you like, the fundamental question that people are often interested in. I've had a lot of questions about. How do we as teachers of a named language navigate between the need to embrace our learners' multilingualism, their multilingual repertoires, and yet our requirement to teach and develop a limited part of those, the English language bit, as English language teachers? There's a sense in which the job that we are employed to do necessarily a priori restricts us from being as translingual as practitioners as we would like to be. And the question as to whether there is a trade-off between those two requirements or those two instincts is important, I think. And linked to that, there is a lot more discussion in the literature on what people are calling translanguaging, about the question of whether we're simply talking about use of the L1 in the L2 classroom. The L1 here, for those of you who are not familiar, referring to the first language of the learners, and the L2 being the target language, the languages that's being taught. There's lots of alternative terms. I tend to quite like using a phrase, the community language. Unlike so many other terms that are used, nearly every community of learners has a community of language, even if that language is English in its widest possible sense, in its lingua franca global sense. And I often use that term, if you like, as an alternative, because a community language can even be translingual. It can be a combination of several different languages, or if you like, elements of repertoire from different languages. The third one here, are translanguaging pedagogy and communicative language teaching oppositional as theories underpinning language learning? And there's surprisingly little written on this. A recent article that I'll touch on has commented on specifically task-based language teaching and translanguaging, but not much written on this. So I'll offer a personal perspective on that as well. And number 4, a kind of a bigger question going beyond the classroom in terms of the theory underpinning it. Are we moving away from current understandings of English communicative competence as the primary outcome of ELT? If so, what are we moving towards? The notion of communicative competence, as I'll touch upon later, was always imagined in a monolingual way, not necessarily designed in that way. Either the early theorizers of it and then the later ones weren't necessarily thinking of just one language, but the fact is they didn't necessarily touch upon multilingual competence in their definitions. So yes, questions and controversies. I didn't realize that was an animation person one. I always like to be clear about the context and communities I'm talking about when I'm teaching. There is a massive bias within the field of TESOL, ELT, towards what we might call the Anglosphere, Anglophone context, the UK, the USA, Australasia, in the sense that nearly all of the discourse that happens around English language teaching takes place in or relative to such places. We're now in a room in the UK. And yet, when I look at the diversity of scholars in the room, or people in the room, we can see the world represented here. And it's important to keep this global awareness in mind. I myself have done much of my work in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if we take the context of South Asia, China, Sub-Saharan Africa together, we find that we're talking about the over 50% of the world population that is constantly neglected in our discussions of language teaching theory and practice. And I want to keep that primarily in my mind. And that means that the majority of us also work in low resource contexts. We may not have the high-tech situations, the access to the internet, the smaller classes that are often necessary to facilitate the kinds and the types of learning that are often prescribed by TESOL discourse. So I want to bear that in mind and to remember that my primary context of English of interest isn't the multilingual classes, as they're so called, that you often get in private language institutions and tertiary education in the UK and the US, but it's of those, specifically those contexts where teachers and learners do share a prior community language, nearly always, and where that language can become a very, very important tool or basis on which to develop learners' Englishing practices. So a little bit of a very brief background to translanguaging theory. This talk is not designed as an introduction to that. Just a quick primer on some important elements of it. It's emerged rapidly as a construct. First of all, the term was was actually coined in Welsh, Trausiethi, by Ken Williams, a Welsh bilingual teacher, who was using it as a means for learners to interact between two different languages, some of whom were competent in one and others in the other in the classroom, and they typically had input and output opportunities in different languages. So in this sense, the translanguaging performed a mediation role. The term was picked up on by a number of scholars. It's often overlooked that people like Claire Crampsh and Penny Cook were talking about translingual practice in 2007, 2008, and then Ophelia Garcia picks up on it, first in the introduction to a book by Macaulay and Penny Cook in 2007, but then in her book on bilingual education, where she finds the term and she really takes it to a new, if you like, position in terms of understanding how it liberates multilinguals from previously monolingual ways of looking at multilingualism. And since then, particularly in the discourse on translanguaging in North America, where often bilingual education models don't allow learners to draw upon their full repertoire in learning, it has become both a means and an end in the struggle to achieve more appropriate, equitable, socially just and decolonized multilingual education. An end in the sense that it gets us to a place where those people can translanguage in the classroom, those of us who are multilinguals, and I'll use the word multi rather than bilingual myself, but also as a means that translanguaging can facilitate that process. The example definition I've put in here, I'll allow you to read it yourself, comes from the book by Ophelia Garcia and Li Wei in 2014, very influential. It's useful, this definition, because it does touch upon education, but also on being a bilingual. And it recognizes both who we are as multilinguals, but it also recognizes, as often people overlook the fact, Garcia and Wei, just like pretty much all scholars that I know of, recognize the fact that society, of course, does create these named languages and entrenches them, or that they become sedimented varieties, as Kanagarajas and others have called it, within society, that to such an extent that they control the ways that we language in ways that don't necessarily reflect who we are as multilinguals. It's not neglected in a lot of these definitions, and it's important to point it out. And importantly, stronger and weaker forms of translanguaging have emerged. This article by Ophelia Garcia and Angel Lin talks about the weaker forms where which are much closer to the older discourses of how much L1 should we use in the classroom, the extent to which weather code switching is appropriate or not. And they talk about the idea of softening the borders between named languages so that as language teachers, we can actually allow for learners to transcend those borders at times in the lesson. But stronger forms which would actually, from a more principled perspective, reject the notion of teaching named languages as separate constructs and argue that in fact our practices in classrooms should be more widely multilingual and allowing learners to translanguage across the curriculum. But this question about what it means for us in so-called named language teaching, specifically ELT, is important. And I think specifically with regard to ELT, because it has become the global language, and people like Philipson have argued, a language of linguistic imperialism, it also means that we're not simply talking about using the L1 and the L2 classroom. We're bearing in mind these important themes about ensuring that education is more appropriate, more socially just, and more decolonized. And that can be difficult because English is, of course, the language of colonization in so many examples around the world. So what probably hasn't changed? Well, in my own thinking, I think that whilst there is a lot of debate about the questions about whether we refer to additional language learning using the older terminology of SLA, second language acquisition, or whether we prefer to use alternatives, as I've argued, and indeed Constance Young and Guadalupe Valdez have as well. I still think it's probably true that learners need the same three things that a lot of earlier SLA research was arguing we needed, and these kind of reflect the hypotheses that many of you will be familiar with: Krashen's input hypothesis, Swain's output hypothesis, and Long's interaction hypothesis, that learners in any context to learn a language, or at least part of a repertoire, need plentiful exposure to that language or to those languaging practices that they're expected to learn. In other words, they need plenty of meaningful input. They also need opportunities to use or to practice the language in meaningful contexts, through output, through opportunities to produce the language and to interact with the language. And as SLA research has shown, learners also need some kind of explicit instruction to support and guide learning relative to these input and output opportunities. And the word "that" there is extra, apologies for that typo. Importantly, that varies quite a lot between stronger and weaker forms of communicative language teaching. In stronger forms, it tends to come through the idea of feedback, or what Long would call focus on form. And in weaker forms, it would involve more explicit instruction, often at different points in the lesson. But I still think that these certain fundamentals that SLA theory has argued are essential for language acquisition, as understood within SLA research, are important. They remain true. But I think they're only part of the picture, because the focus of SLA on implicit learning as the primary goal of language teaching and learning can no longer be accepted. I think it can no longer be assumed to be the only thing that we can or should do in language classrooms. And I'll come back to this point later in the lesson. Lecture, later in the talk. Oh dear. Yes, so to look at more specific questions, which I think are kind of in my mind and the mind of many language teachers, beyond those questions I touched on earlier, what I've called emerging pedagogic questions, they still need these three elements in the target language or in this part of their repertoire. But what exactly happens around the input and output opportunities? In other words, they don't take up the whole lesson, and what do we do in the language use around them? How exactly do we do explicit instruction from a languaging perspective, regardless of whether you're looking at a stronger or a weaker version of CLT? To what extent might the input, output, and interaction opportunities themselves become translingual, which I think is probably what is being argued for in stronger forms of translanguaging? And what else do learners need to be confident, capable, and empowered language users rather than simply learners? And I think these are some of the emerging areas of discussion about translanguaging in TESOL. A really good article by Graham Hall on this from 2020, a very recent meta and systematic review, shall I call it, by John et al., and a very good one by Kim and Wang from 2022. The last one I particularly recommend as a narrative review, and I'll come back to it. So how does CLT as orthodoxy deal with these questions? Let's look at, first of all, at actually just a kind of an image that I'm starting to think might be a useful way of looking at this. That there is a sense in which when either of them moves into its stronger form, it provides less opportunity for the other to happen. In other words, I'm arguing that they're not necessarily, that the two approaches, communicative language teaching and translanguaging, are not necessarily easily harmonized. That when you're adopting a stronger form of CLT, you often are only creating weak opportunities for translanguaging, and a stronger form of translanguaging creates weaker opportunities for communicative language teaching. Let me explain what I mean by that by looking at them specifically. So if we look at the strong CLT perspective, specifically task-based language teaching, it emerged initially as a process-oriented monolingual pedagogy. Even in Prabhu's classrooms, the pedagogy that was adopted there was monolingual, and it was importantly teacher-centered with no group work and pair work. But as it evolved within, say, Long's work, in America, Mike Long's work, it remained obviously a fairly monolingual pedagogy, often working in classrooms where learners didn't have a shared language. And for the acquisition of the target language, task-based language teaching has always assumed that learners need to use it interactively and meaningfully through communication-focused tasks. And so far, academics have struggled to marry translanguaging pedagogy with TBLT. This article by Easton Wang from last year is a really interesting one, I think, and well written. They're not too optimistic about it, and they believe that the monolingual principle still makes sense during tasks. And they do acknowledge that translanguaging is more authentic for many learners who have the opportunity to do so, particularly in classrooms who share the wider repertoire of the individual. It's more authentic, of course, and it can facilitate achievement of task outcomes, but they don't really address the how much question, because if we accept that in its norm, there's no reason why those learners need to use English at all. If we take, just choosing some of the classrooms from our colleagues in the room, if we take classes in China, the vast majority of classes in China, the community language is Mandarin Chinese. There's no need to use English at all to achieve the task outcome. And then, therefore, how can task-based language teaching facilitate learning? If we took a classroom in Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, you'd find something similar, that they would use Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa Indonesia. Or Japan, it might be similar, that they would adopt Japanese as the means to achieve the task outcome. An article by Seals et al. As well, who argued that the L1 may be used for task planning rehearsal, and they find some really interesting outcomes relative to that it does help. It seems to help them with the planning of a task as a scaffolding mechanism to enable them to do better in the task itself, I think is an interesting point. And I think arguably, if you take, say, the Willis model of task-based language teaching, where there's also the post-task preparation for reporting back, then it can also be used usefully at that stage in the lesson. And I think, I'm not sure if there's any research on this, but corrective feedback itself could also be used, involve a translingual type of feedback, which I've often documented in my own research, where a teacher provides feedback and often provides a little bit of meta explanation of the correct form that they've given in the mother tongue, to help the learner to both understand the correct form, to accept it, and to be able to continue more meaningfully with the discussion. A very quick, if you like, switch into the mother tongue for that specific process, or to the community language. But I still think this is quite a weak range of opportunities for translanguaging. Not as much, in my opinion, as a weaker CLT perspective. If we take, for example, a PPP approach, a task-supported language teaching, or my own CAPE model, I think there are many more opportunities for teaching in such approaches, and teaching itself can be translingual. For example, when we're teaching grammar, there are lots of arguments that have been presented for a long time now about the use of the L1, which can facilitate explicit grammar instruction and reduce cognitive load for the learner while doing so. The same is also true of phonology. And both of these can also be translingual in the sense that comparative analysis can support learning. We can compare sounds in our language and in the resource set or English that we're learning, and so on and so forth. There's also opportunities for translation, particularly with regard to lexical learning, which has always been used, I think, by teachers who have drawn upon the learner's first language in the classroom. But weak CLT still tends to assume that classroom communication should remain in English, or the target language, as a primary opportunity for exposure and use. But that this, I suppose, Rabbage's study in South Korea is interesting, looking at how teachers are willing to use a little bit of the mother tongue, or in this case, Korean, to facilitate understanding and learning, I think is an important point. But nonetheless, I think there is still this implicit assumption within all forms of CLT that English should be the language of primary communication in the classroom. And I don't think this necessarily needs to be the case in a translingual approach. And I think also weak CLT offers the opportunities for learner informal translanguaging. Li Wei refers a lot to translanguaging spaces in his writings. And I think when learners are doing things like grammar practice activities and exercises, which is kind of a staple of a lot of more traditional focus types of teaching, then learners often can draw upon the mother tongue or the community language very usefully at such times to explain to each other what the answer is and why, to help each other to understand and to translate little bits or the whole sentence and so on. So if I were to give a recap, hopefully that diagram now makes a bit more sense. I would argue that weaker forms of communicative language teaching offer more opportunities for translanguaging, but that translanguaging itself and communicative language teaching aren't necessarily strongly compatible. In other words, a shift of some kind needs to take place if we are to accept translanguaging as a valid dominant means of looking at language teaching. And this key point that time spent translanguaging is inevitably seen as time taken away from using or from maximizing the use of the target language, which means that we end up again being in this kind of general argument of how much of the L1 should be used in the L2 classroom, which is one of the points that some of the critics of translanguaging mentioned. Janine Schreifers-Dallas argues we need to find what is the optimum amount, something that Ernesto Macaro was doing about 20 years ago trying to do. And in many of our research, we found that there is no optimum amount because contexts simply vary too much and it's too complex. So the question that remains for me is how to move beyond this impasse, this question of are we simply reducing it back to a question of using the L1 in the L2 classroom? Or is there something else, something bigger with regard to what translanguaging can afford for language teaching? So one way of looking at that is to look at the emerging frameworks for translanguaging. And obviously, I don't have time to cover all of these, just touching on one of them, I think would be difficult. I still think the general frameworks still have a lot of application. The book by Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues talks about translanguaging stance, translanguaging design, and translanguaging shifts. And I think those three elements are still quite powerful and important in any classroom. In Europe, Hassan Ithenos and Dirk Gorter, they're writing on pedagogical and spontaneous translanguaging in a continuum. I would prefer the word principled rather than pedagogic, but the key point being that we can move along that continuum at different points in the lesson. And Joanna Duarte's work in the Netherlands, some really interesting frameworks, very specific ones, for working with what we in the UK would call EAL learners, English as an additional language learners in UK mainstream classrooms. I think their framework is very detailed and useful, but less applicable in foreign language teaching. In TESOL, a recent systematic review using the meta-ethnography approach by John et al. Has come up with the image that you can see, the large circular framework, and the table 4 also comes from the same. You'll see the same different elements there, which looks at things like the resources that we use, both linguistic and non-linguistic, such as meta, such as other semiotic resources. The method in terms of translative, where the translanguaging is being used for translating versus the two languages being interwoven, what Kanagareja would call code meshing. And the function as well, identifying 4 potential functions that are common in the literature: material, managerial, skill building, and expressive, and also issues to do with identity and culture. Often we see, and the Kim and Weng study also shows this, a distinction between the ESL context, where translanguaging becomes a really important tool for learner identity expression and for access and equity in the classroom, versus the EFL distinction, where translanguaging is seen more, not simply, but more as a means to facilitate learning, rather than simply one for learners to ascertain their identity and their right, if you like, to use their languages and full repertoires in the classroom. And I think these frameworks are interesting, but the two in TESOL, the two that I mentioned there, come primarily from essentially literature reviews of what seems to be happening in classrooms, rather than from any theoretical viewpoint. And I think it's interesting to start to question whether a more carefully theorized approach for language teaching, particularly ELT, additional language teaching, could be imagined, could be developed. And whilst one which a colleague and I are working on isn't yet fully formed enough for me to share here, I think I'll share a few thoughts in terms of what I think might be possibilities for how we can move towards a more appropriate way of understanding translanguaging for TESOL. So the first one is to reevaluate how we understand competence, and that might be a solid theoretical basis on which to begin, but also to the question of whether we can move beyond assuming competence as the sole or even the primary goal of what we do in additional language education. And I'll use the acronym AIL there. Quite like that one. So the first one, reevaluating and redefining communicative competence. Well, it's typically seen as a monolingual construct with 4 elements. Actually, it was interesting that the original work by Hines saw it as a means, if you've ever read the paper, it's interesting to actually include culture in the language classroom. He didn't talk about the 4 different strands that Canale and Swain talked about: sociolinguistic, strategic, linguistic, and strategic, linguistic, and discourse competence, isn't it? Thank you. But he was focusing as much on including the culture in the classroom. In other words, his notion of communicative competence could have been a multi-semiotic and a translingual competence, much more than I think in Canale and Swain's work. And there is the possibility there of adding additional competencies. I've suggested translingual competence. I'm not the first to do so. And Kanagaraja's fascinating idea of performative competence, where he actually subverts Chomsky's, it's not a dichotomy, Chomsky never created it as a dichotomy, but performance as the, if you like, the evidence of the underlying competence. But he talks about performative competence, I think, is a very interesting idea. And if you haven't read the book, I strongly recommend it, Translingual Practices. Now, either of those can create the opportunities for more authentic translingual practices as both the norms and the goals of language teaching. For example, mediation activities that have become very important in the current Common European Framework, translation activities and comparative analysis activities can all become part of the norms of what is language education or languages education. And that, I think, can add something interesting to what we've looked at in terms of opportunities for using other languages in the target language classroom. How it impacts learning is still not clear. There simply isn't enough research. A really interesting study by Yuzlu and Dekilitash, which compares offering a grammar translation approach, what they call a translanguaging pedagogy approach, and a communicative language teaching approach in 3 groups in a fairly good quality, not quite a randomized controlled trial, but I think a fairly good experimental study found a positive impact of the translanguaging approach above the other 2, in the sense the one that didn't simply draw upon a grammar translation approach or a communicative approach, the one that kind of adopted elements of both more eclectically, seemed to work better. But it's just one study, and we obviously need a lot more research on this. And then the second idea would be to move beyond competence only. SLA research has tended to assume that the only meaningful goal of language education is to develop learner communicative competence. I would even call this the proficiency obsession of SLA, the assumption that what language education is about is developing our learners' proficiency in a target language. And it isn't. It never has been, and it never will be. Because if you look at any curriculum for language education, such as the French language curriculum in the UK or Spanish, Claire Crampsch does this with the American curricula, the French curricula, the German curricula. Tony Lydekker has done this with the Japanese curriculum. And if you look at the Chinese core competencies curriculum, you see a wide range of potential goals, outcomes, and opportunities for learning on these formal curriculum used in secondary and primary education that are meaningful, that are useful, and that are important as language learners beyond simply developing proficiency in the so-called target language. In other words, the SLA obsession is only a small part of what we as additional language teachers, instructors, should be interested in. And in a recent article, I've argued for what I've called a post-competence perspective that doesn't necessarily go beyond it, but recognizes this alternative way of looking at language education. And again, I'm thinking about the norms and realities for so many language learners around the world today, and those in the room who have been exposed to these systems and have had to learn English initially and other languages in systems such as these. It's interesting to see, to have your perspective on what we're looking at here. That we need to balance the so-called competence orientation that has been the obsession of SLA research with a literacy orientation, in which languages are understood more as social constructs than simply innate processes that we gain through opportunities for exposure and use. And we recognize that so much of what we value in education, in language use today, relates to things that don't necessarily happen naturally, but need to be taught and learnt, such as literacy. Basic literacy is the obvious example. We don't gain it naturally. It is a social construct, and yet it's immensely useful. And today, for so many learners of, say, English around the world, the written form of the language is actually far more important than the spoken form, in the sense that it enables them to access university education, enables them to access international discourses, and yet the opportunities or the needs for them to actually engage in spoken use of English is, I think, lower than it would have been in the past. And arguably, as some scholars have referred, we're moving much more from a marketplace model of language teaching to what historically was called a monastic model, in the sense that the written form of the language was more valued, even though if today it's nothing to do with monasteries. So in relation to this, I've argued that we can look at these two different ways of looking at language learning and language development as orientations on a continuum, with a position in the middle, a pluralist orientation, which is where most languages education is going to be happening, most additional language teaching is going to be happening. So the competence orientation is generally kind of the one that's accepted in SLA models. And the alternative, I think, is a literacy orientation, where we value learning as much as acquisition, where we value a communal, externally defined syllabus alongside the internal syllabus of the learner. And we recognize that this is a social norm. It's never changed since the start of education, and it will never change. Governments sponsor it. They pay per child per year, on average in OECD countries, $10,000 for that child to be learning. They have a stake in that learning, and that stake will never disappear. The teacher role, to guide and scaffold development as much as to create the conditions for acquisition, the learner role relative to that. And you can see texts, register genres relative to what's sometimes called text-based language teaching, and so on. And the teaching practices and learning processes themselves, I think, can all recognize alternatives to the bias that has been inherent in the SLA perspective. And importantly, towards the bottom of this framework, the repertoire focus, where you've got the target language prioritized versus the more enabled languages prioritized. So if we take a typical example in, say, Chinese secondary education, where the teacher would do a lot of the teaching in Mandarin Chinese because of the need to develop the literacy orientation of the learner. It isn't stupid, it isn't misguided, it isn't dumb, it's normal. And because the enacted curriculum also recognizes the exam as being central to those learners' education, to their future, then the teacher is probably doing the wise thing. My own research in India taught me time and time again, visiting teachers in disadvantaged communities across the country in both urban and rural contexts, that if those learners didn't get through that high school exam, it was education over for them. If they didn't get through their grade 9 exam, they never got to higher secondary education. They didn't get through their grade 10 exam, they never got to the last 2 years, and of course grade 12 to get to university. This is a reality of all education. It has been for many years. People always decry it. It's still true in the UK. It's been true in the UK for 50 years, and it will continue to be true in the UK. The exam isn't the tail wagging the dog. It's just part of the dog. In fact, tails are. So I would argue that if we were to recognize both a literacy and a competence orientation, then we can see many more opportunities for translanguaging, particularly if we recognize that the majority of educational systems adopt something in the middle between those orientations. In a sense, they're pluralist perspectives. And the pluralist perspective, of course, if I just go back to the previous table, looking at the bottom from the third row, the repertoire focus is adaptive. In a sense, it's adapting between different parts of the learner's repertoire to facilitate learning of whatever type is required. And this is where translanguaging then gets into the space where it's always been. In other words, to facilitate learner learning across the curriculum in the classroom. So if we adopt this focus, the pluralist perspective disrupts the locus of additional language education from the so-called natural language acquisition that disadvantages many EFL contexts worldwide because of the realities of the classroom, the curriculum, and the outcomes. It's capable of incorporating multiple diverse goals beyond simply proficiency development. And even though that isn't necessarily devalued, it's recognized as important, but the language education is so much more than that. It's about awareness of self and other. It's about understanding our position in the world, and it's about understanding what our language means to us and our identity relative to other people, as Claire Crampsh has pointed out. The identified competencies and literacies can also be of value, and research in India by Leena Mukhopadhyay is interesting here, that we can actually look at how learners can recognize and value their translingual competence in the classroom. And then the opportunities for translanguaging increase significantly as a result of this. For supporting development of basic literacies, specifically remembering that a large number of learners around the world don't learn to read and write in the same written script that English uses, and therefore those literacies, typically the development of them continues into secondary education across much of China, across much of India, across much of Asia and Africa. Basic literacies and critical literacies, these interact in complex ways, but they're also important as separate things. Our ability to interpret the information we're receiving critically. And that continues into tertiary education, as we know. In China, I can't remember when it was, but I was there in 2018, and recently they just began to employ teachers of critical thinking in Chinese universities. And of course, the criticality only went so far. You weren't allowed to criticize the government, but there was still a desire to do that. And that's an important thing to recognize, that this is a literacy that continues into university levels. Translation literacies, awareness of how different languages do different things, higher order thinking skills, social emotional learning, learner identity development, education specific skills. For example, how we reference, how we access those academic articles, a constant obsession of learners in universities. And also the meta strategies that we use to support our own education and those of our learners. Translanguaging opportunities can happen around all of these as key parts of what we do in classrooms. And therefore translanguaging arguably is no longer in opposition to key goals of additional language education. That's the idea. Right, and I thought I did mention that I'd touch on some examples. Here are just a few ones I've used before. One which I quite often like using, and you can use this both in a so-called multilingual and a bilingual classroom, translingual news comparison, where learners compare the same news story as presented in two different languages, a community shared language and English, to look at, for example, not only what the story says, but the perspective that is taken on it, to develop simultaneously their translation literacies alongside their critical literacies. Research and present projects where learners research something online in English and mediate to peers through a translingual presentation. This links a little bit to Ken Williams' original idea for translanguaging, but it also goes beyond it, because learners, this is something that nearly all of us need to do in English or with English. We need to go online and find information that is only available in English. And yet the people we present it to don't necessarily need to hear it just in English, in the sense that if I was, for example, a student in Hong Kong, and I was presenting to my classmates about online research I've done, there would be nothing more natural, more communicative than for me to combine English and Cantonese in that conversation, and potentially even resources from Mandarin Chinese, and so on. Sorry, I'm using examples from people in the room. And then grammar or phonology teaching. We can, for example, help our learners to develop posters on specific areas of language that compare and contrast it with the community language. One of the things I noticed when I first went to Eritrea is that the way that English literacy was taught wasn't necessarily linked very closely to the prior literacies that the learners have, which is in the Tigrinya language and the Ge'ez alphabet. They use that, and the Saho language, which has only recently become literalized, written down, using a very similar language to English, but phonetically very, very shallow in the sense that there is a very good sound pronunciation, sound spelling correspondence that enabled the Saho learners to gain English literacy more easily than the Tigrinya speaking learners. And yet, by comparing the three, we created affordances for all of them to learn about all three languages, in the sense that they can learn about their own language alongside the others. And this poster is based on work which we did in classrooms with teachers and learners to notice these differences. And also exploring translation literacy, which I think still isn't really kind of in vogue, even though Guy Cook has argued for it to be useful, and Graham Hall has as well, that translation can be a massive source of interest through developing our awareness of things like metaphor, of simile, of difference, of relationships, through looking at poetry, songs, and drama, things that learners are really interested in often, or at least which society values. And I think Steve Mann is doing a talk on translanguaging relative to drama in this series later in the term. So there we go, just a few simple ideas of the kinds of things that might be possible and might be useful to facilitate within a reimagined translanguaging classroom. Right, those are the references. The slides are available online through that QR code if I've got my tech right. Feel free to press on that, or to just go to my personal website, jasonanderson.org.uk, and you should be able to find them there on the talks page if interested. Yes, and just to mention there of some really interesting pieces, right at the bottom is the Uslund Akilitash study, and also right at the bottom, no, where is it? I'll put it in there. Halfway up, Kim and Wang. It's in TESOL EJ, but I think it's a really good systematic review, a narrative review on what they call pedagogical translanguaging, which is the term used by Chinoz and Gorta, but in fact it looks at translanguaging pedagogy in general as well. But it's a really good one, I think. And John and et al.'s recent one is also there. Cool, and as a few of mine that I've cited. Right, that's it. Questions, critique. Can we get the online people back in the room? Right, we've got one question in the room. Tilly, Holly, we're going to do a microphone thing. Okay. If I pop this microphone in the middle of the room, then if you just, I'll give it to you anyway. There we go.
Thank you, Jason. That was really very, very interesting, excellent talk, and yeah, exemplary in this program. But one thing I was just wondering about is, where do you see digital literacy in the literacies? Because I think it's a really interesting point that literacy is important. Yeah. And I was just thinking, and I was looking and thinking, he's going to mention it, and then I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I forgot to mention it. It's really important, and it all links into that, because when we look at how we use digital literacy, almost anybody in the room who's multilingual will pull out their device, look at their chats, and they'll often see translanguaging specifically in those conversations. Becoming literate in those and becoming literate in new ways of doing those is really important. Here on the TESOL, students who are sometimes finding it difficult to understand content presented in English are using multiple diverse things to translate it immediately. I was doing a lecture the other day and using the microphone feature here, and a student was using Otter AI to transcribe it so that as I was talking, she was getting subtitles in the room on her own device alongside the slides where she was making multilingual notes. And so the digital literacies are enmeshed in these in ways that I think...
I thought perhaps it might be that you thought that the context you were talking about, whether the resources are, might be inappropriate, but I'm just wondering whether you think actually that doesn't apply, because anywhere in the world you're going to need it.
Yeah, you're not inappropriate because I think I was just thinking about the range of contexts in which we work, and therefore, in some contexts, the digital literacies aren't necessarily available. But even that's changing rapidly. And so, for example, in my research in India in 2019, 2020, teachers only had one device in the classroom, a mobile phone, but they still managed to make use of it to show learners videos of things happening in the classroom, and the students would sometimes pass it round to do little checks while she was teaching. Even at that point, she was making really creative use of the one opportunity they had for digital literacy.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Tim.
So, I mean, I think.
Would you like the microphone?
Oh, yeah, sure. But I'm maybe one of the loudest people in the room, but I'll use it anyway. Yeah, so one of the issues I have when I'm looking at translanguaging is that there's so many definitions, right? And you sort of have this translanguaging as what we used to call code switching. It's a description of something that sometimes happens in classrooms. There's also sort of like translanguaging as a belief about languages, and it's quite like post-structural. And there's also like maybe like almost like a belief system, like translanguaging is a good thing, it's a type of space, it's all these other things as well. And so my question was really like, I agree with all the things you're saying. I think some of them, I remember being at a talk at Korea TESOL in 2008 before anyone had heard of translanguaging. And they were recommending a lot of similar things to what you were saying. And so I guess my question is, like, given all this baggage that comes along with translanguaging, and so for me, like someone who isn't post-structuralist in that kind of way, what, like, is it necessary to use translanguaging, or do you think, like, because what did I write there? It was like, well, you talk about translanguaging competence, but wouldn't code switching competence be like as good an equivalent?
In my opinion, it's quite strong on this. No, it wouldn't. And for reasons that Ophelia Garcia has pointed out on a number of occasions, and many people would differ with me here, which is why it's important, obviously, to recognize the other perspective. Janine Treffers-Dallas, in her two pieces, and a piece recently, argues for the code switching perspective. Code switching is still, if you like, located within a monolingual way of looking at language. That languages are the a priori constructs. They exist before all acts of communication. And therefore, when we communicate, we're moving between languages. We're forever shuttling between boxes rather than actually understanding us as multilinguals, our practices, our cognition as being primary, and the languages as being, if you like, a subsequent construct that was reified in the languages movement. I mean, if we look at it historically, we can look at how in the late Middle Ages, essentially, the post-Renaissance era, Europe actually identified the languages as the key element that created national identities. And since then, these named languages have become such strong constructs that it's difficult to believe for many people that that's not necessarily true to our cognition. Now, the question about what is present in our cognition is an important one because there's a lot of difference in opinion there. Jeff McSwan has pushed back on a lot of the translanguaging arguments of a unified repertoire. But even Jeff McSwan recognizes and concedes that in our brains, we do have a multilingual repertoire, and languages are definitely not separated in any obvious and simple sense. And all of the code switching research provides beautiful evidence to support the idea that when multilinguals talk, they language in the sense that they draw upon their repertoire flexibly depending on context, interlocutor, and use. And the attempts of code switching research to identify reasons for switching, in other words, there has to be a reason to change language rather than simply I'm drawing upon all the resources in my repertoire, remains a consistent way to differentiate negatively towards bilinguals for using their whole repertoire, when a monolingual who uses their whole repertoire is in no way seen as being deficient or unusual. So to my mind, it's a really important from the perspective of equity, and from the perspective of social justice, and therefore from a decolonizing perspective, because it tends to be Western European ways of looking at the world and Northern ways of looking at the world, if we accept dos Santos's arguments about global social justice, that are imposing on so many users and languages in the global South and around the world. And it's not just in the global South. The point is that the British government did a very, very good job of stealing the multilingualism from the British people. They didn't quite succeed with Wales, and Wales has regained its multilingualism with such a passion, as Scotland is doing now. with its Gaelic multilingualism as part of its recognised identity. But the key point being that that set of realities of essentially removing so much of the language diversity from countries, it's when I come close to you, isn't it? It's something which I think removing that diversity from so many countries hasn't necessarily happened. And I always come back to the examples I know well, South Asia, particularly India, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where you see so much diversity, where you see language continua, not just between communities in, say, Uganda or Eritrea, but also within individuals, that these continua that are there in the communities actually happen within the person, depending on where they are and who they're interacting with. That tells us something really important, that as Macaulay and Pennycook argued in their article and subsequent book on disinventing and reconstituting languages, the notion of the named language is essentially a colonial construct. And the way that they discuss, and it's true what they say, because I've done a lot of historical research in the Indian subcontinent, that it was imposed on India, that they essentially identified groups of speakers, called this a language, documented it, sedimented it, and argued that this is how they must language as their language, because they couldn't actually recognize the colonial colonizers, that languaging was more complex in these contexts. And that reified and continued to keep the myth of named languages as being fundamental to who we are and our identities as multilinguals, when in fact, it's itself a construct. Very long answer to a short question.
Sorry, the question was that short either. So,
Holly, have we got any questions online? Yeah. Who is it? Oh. We hear. Yvette, if you have a question, I can't see if you can turn your microphone on. I think Holly's got you online, but feel free to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. I can hear myself actually somehow. Anyway, I think it's a very rich talk. I just wondering, I want to pick up the point you made about the distinguishing EFL and EAL, and the kind of difference between translanguaging and talking about using L1 in language classrooms. What I find sometimes unsatisfying in some translanguaging scholarship is they tend to portray using L1 as completely positive, and the kind of, when they talk about ideologies, when they talk about oppressions, the kind of ideology that is problematic is usually surround the target language. So the kind of native speakerism, where people are pursuing a kind of unrealistic and undesirable L2 goal. But what they don't really talk about is the ideologies around L1. So especially, I'm thinking about the Chinese context. Actually, one of my supervisees was talking about it in her dissertation. For Chinese students, there is a kind of sentiment that using L2, so using English, is shameful. So you are showing off your language proficiency, you are being pretentious, and learners judge each other based on that, and they are afraid of being judged by others because of that. So there is a kind of monolingual L1 ideology that is very prevalent in language classroom, especially when I go beyond English language teaching, because I was a Japanese major student, and there was a constant tension, as a someone who studied Japanese language in China, if you can say the very complex political relationship between the two countries. As a Japanese learners, sometimes you're actually not encouraged, and you are not really seen positive when you use L2, when you use the language you are learning. And I was being told by my teachers that if you speak Chinese, speak it properly. Don't get influenced. You don't speak Chinese in a Japanese way. And so there are lots of this kind of monolingual ideologies, exist regarding L1, not just L2. But what usually gets talked about, I think, in translanguaging scholarship, is this kind of, it's usually surrounding the perfect target language, but not really, I think, talking enough about the things related to L1. So I just wondering, like, how you see this kind of thing, and whether you know any articles that might address this kind of issues, and also perhaps there are some, unique challenges for translanguaging pedagogy in EFL classroom, so foreign language classroom, because it's foreign. There is something political, ideological going on, there. Yeah. I don't know if my question makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you. Santosh Mahapatra and I wrote an article a few years ago on what we call a languages for learning framework, in which we reimagine India's multilingualism and a potential framework for how a more equitable approach towards both mainstream education but also learning languages can work in those contexts. Because in India you have a very diluted version of what China often experiences, the need to impose a language that is often L2 for many Chinese speakers, Mandarin Chinese, Putonghua, on many Chinese people as the so-called L1. And in the sense that the perception is that this is our L1 and English is our L2, when so many Chinese people have other languages other than Mandarin Chinese that are often positioned as dialects rather than languages themselves, and therefore devalued. So in the sense that there is a very strong language ideology in many countries existing that posits a named language identity onto the learners as their L1, I think it's a really important point. And Santosh and I talk about, in the Indian context, about how, for example, Marathi is imposed on many people in the state of Maharashtra, despite the fact that it is itself extremely diverse. Now, India is trying to adopt a much more multilingual approach than, say, China is, obviously, as national policy, and therefore it should be commended for that. But the reality is that teachers and learners always need to see that, teachers and policymakers always need to see that learners are often multiple in their multilingualisms, and that often what we see as being L1, L2 is really a much more complex combination. And Li Wei has written about this recently in the UK when he talks, I can't remember when the article is, but it's quite recent, last 5 years, when he talks about a Chinese learner in a UK education context, an EAL context, where that learner was specifically assumed to be a speaker of Mandarin Chinese, when in fact the learner didn't actually speak Mandarin Chinese very well at all and wasn't comfortable using it. And the class were using him as an authority on that language, and he became uncomfortable. And that was kind of stereotyping him as being a Mandarin L1 speaker, when in fact, again, he wasn't. So in that sense, I think there are some examples of what you're talking about, of L1 ideologies imposing on how we understand and how we use our learners' repertoires in the classroom, which itself, I think, kind of supports the idea of moving away from a code switching approach to looking at language, because that can often see it's either L1 or L2, and the switching approach being the problem. Right, well, I think we're time up, aren't we, Holly? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Holly, for that. Thank you.